right. Welcome everybody to session 6B, which is Minds and Minotaurs in English Poetry. I would like to thank Ken Graham and the organizing team for facilitating this online event, as well as our wonderful support, including Andy and Jason. I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the Mi'kma'ki, which is the ancestral and unceded territories of the Micmac people. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which did not deal with surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Micmac and Maliseet titles and established rules for what was going to be an ongoing relationship between nations. So I will now introduce our second speaker, and then we'll be able to have Q&A for both speakers at the end of the session. Danila Sokolov earned his PhD from the University of Waterloo and is currently Assistant Professor of English at the University of Iceland, Reykjavik. He is the author of Renaissance Texts, Medieval Subjectivities, Rethinking Petrarchan Desire from Wyatt to Shakespeare, and essays on early modern English literature and culture published or forthcoming in the Journal of Medieval and Early Modern Studies, Modern Philology, the Philological Quarterly, the Sydney Journal, Studies in English Literature, Studies in Philology, Modern Language Quarterly, Law and Literature, and ELH. Take it away, Danila.
Thank you very much. Some metaphors seem too familiar, too weary to warrant further attention. What could be more predictable, more commonplace than the association of poetry with gold? Early modern English poets are surrounded by gold. The god and patron, William Brown writes, is gold-haired Apollo, Muse's sacred king. The Muses in Michael Drayton Elysium praise Apollo, if thou but touch thy golden lyre, the rocks feel in themselves a fire and rise up to come near thee. In Milton's At a Solemn Music, angels touch their mortal harps of golden wires. In Abraham Cooley's muse appears in his vision bearing a golden harp with silver strings. Robert Chamberlain's A Harmony of the Muses promises that Apollo here in muse strings his golden lyre. Of course, actual gold and poetry do not always mingle, as Christopher Marlowe laments in his famous parable from Hero and Leander, poetry and poverty always kiss, and to this day is every scholar poor, grows gold, from them runs headlong to the bore. Don't I know it? Poets can offer lovers only their poems, despite the fact that the poet's god arrayed in robes of gold of his gilt harp, the well-tuned strings doth hold. But does it matter? Poets have their own gold. What should the sons of art dream of the philosopher's stone that turneth into gold whatsoever it toucheth? Exclaims Gabriel Harvey, for no philosopher's stone is equivalent to such divine works. Besides, not all poets are necessarily poor. As George Putnam writes, in most civil countries and commonwealths, good poets and poesy were highly esteemed and much favored. Under Alexander the Great, for example, Charillus, one not very great poet, had for every verse well made a Philip Snowball of gold, amounting in value to an angel English. The most deeply entrenched connection is the figure of poesis itself as gold. The paradigmatic claim here is Sir Philip Sidney's assertion that the world of nature is brazen, the poets only deliver it golden. Sidney's Greek tutor, Nathaniel Baxter, in his Sir Philip Sidney's Urania, assures the readers that eternal fame shall blazon golden verse. George Chapman's Ovid promises to inscribe in golden verse the marvels reigning in his sovereign bliss. And he also praises Ben Jonson's Sejanus as more than golden verse. John Day claims that the true poet refuses to build a sumptuous pyramid of golden verse over the ruins of an ignoble hearse. And in a sonnet by William Drummond of Hawthorne, it appears as a figure of humility. His writing in ragged rhymes is overcharged with brass, he admits, in contrast to these so golden times. Well, there's little surprise here. Gold is a privileged substance and a privileged signifier in Western culture. Value of gold absolutely guaranteed, writes Jean-Joseph Gou, becomes a metaphor for the transcendental guarantee of meaning. Figure offers the anchoring points that moors the floating chain of signifiers. The position of gold is determined by its material and symbolic value, durability, economic reward, public recognition, and aesthetic beauty, among other things. Further minted into currency, gold enacts striking homologies with figurative language. In early modern England, for example, the accumulation of capital through commodity production, consumption, and trade resonated with the humanist poetics of rhetorical profit. The figure was also nourished by the association of poetry with material physical labor applied to language on the one hand, and the material physical properties of pre-modern money on the other. What I'd like to suggest in this paper, however, is that the language of gold is not fully unproblematic. Catherine Bates, in her brilliant reading of Sidney's Defense, points out that this fantasy of a golden world of poetic production can easily become a nightmare of fetishistic idolatry. But I'm more interested in the unsettling disruptive energies stirring within the conceit itself. What attracts me could perhaps be described as the latent pathology within the image, its chaotic or impure aspects that do not want to be noticed or thought, but without which the significance of the image cannot be fully grasped. For inspiration, I turn to the writings of the French philosopher of art, Georges de Berman, who writes that we must try before the image to think the negative force within it. There is a work of the negative in the image, a dark efficacy that, so to speak, eats away at the visible, the order of represented appearances, and murders the legible, the order of signifying configurations. My goal, following de Berman, is to problematize the serenity of the iconography of Poesius as gold and to highlight its dynamic and polarized structure, as he writes, conflictual and unstable, constituted of unappeasable movements and pulsations. I do not wish to destroy the beauty of the image of gold, rather I seek to think through some of the imaginative compulsions that the commonplace figure seeks to repress. What is coiled within or at the limits of the dazzlingly sensual image of gold? Metamorphosis, disfiguration, history. For all the solidity, durability, and consistency of gold, the image is highly dynamic. Sidney's poets deliver a golden world, and gold emerges as a result of labor in all senses of the word. Gold is always already an allegory of a complex network of human relationships with the world. Gold becomes the measure of value only because the exchange value of all commodities is estimated in gold, Marx writes, but he adds that the real measure of commodity and gold is labor itself. But Marx could teach early moderns precious little, for gold in mines where none doth draw it forth, John Donne reminds us, is worthless. The richest mines of gold hidden in the wombs of rocks, William Prinn concurs, whence not digged out with pains they useless lie, and none are bettered or enriched thereby. According to Catherine Phillips, gold and coined had been unuseful, nor with glory shined. Indeed, the figure to which early modern English poetry returns compulsively is the metaphor of poetry as mining and refining of gold ore and subsequent coinage or other forms of goldsmithing. Drayton praises noble Chaucer, who don't be pun on English coin, who first enriched our English with his rhymes, delving in the mine of perfect knowledge which he could refine and coin for current. Ben Jonson, while he was still friends with Chapman, praised Chapman's translation of Hesiod, whose work could this be, Chapman, to refine old Hesiod's ore and give it to us, but thine, who hadst before wrought in rich Homer's mine. It is often deployed as a modesty topos. Dunnigan, comparing his verse to gold, unfavorably comparing his verse to gold, insists that since rich mines in barren grounds are shown, may not I yield, not gold, but coal or stone. And my favorite example, Anne Bradstreet hopes that her poetic efforts will throw into relief the beauty of others' verse. This mean and unrefined stuff of mine will make your glistering gold, but more to shine. She also wants a laurel of a wreath of parsley as laurel. But this natural elaboration of the trope, I think, harbors a chaotic and disruptive potential. Where the gold of poetry is solid, flawless, and lustrous and beautiful, the processes of mining, refining, and goldsmithing are anything but. Unless found in rivers, gold ore is dug up in underground mines. Upon extraction, the quality of ore has to be established by assaying. The next step is crushing, for in many cases, gold ores have to be ground to release particles of the precious metal with the dross washed away. And then comes smelting in furnaces and refining. Gold, this means darkness, noise, dirt, smoke, and soot. Pliny's Natural History, for example, describes gold mining as so painful and toilsome that it surpasseth the wonderful works of the giants in old times. Sometimes laborers, he continues, meet with rocks of flint and rags, which they are driven to pierce and cleave through with fire and vinegar. But for that, the vapor and smoke that ariseth from thence by the means may stifle and choke them within those narrow pits and mines. They are forced to give over such firework and betake themselves oftentimes to great mattocks and pickaxes. At other times, Pliny writes, they hollow out the mountain and collapse the shafts. Then all at once, he writes, on a sudden the mountain cleaveth in sunder, and making a long chink, falleth down with such a noise and crack as is beyond the conceit of man's understanding. Joseph Acosta, in the Natural and Moral History of the East and West Indies from the English translations from 1604, writes that those digging for precious metals labor in these mines in continual darkness and obscurity. And for as much as those places are never visited with the sun, there is not only continual darkness, but such an extreme cold, with so gross an air contrary to the disposition of man. Appealing to Pliny's authority, he calls the mines the place of the damned. Although he speaks of the silver mines of Potosi in Peru, he notes that drawing out of gold is no less laborious or dangerous. As Marlowe's translation of Ovid's Elegies puts it, in the golden age, gold, silver, iron, heavy weights, and brass in hell were harbored. Here was found no mess. Elsewhere in his book, Acosta compares the sound of earthquakes to that of gunpowder in mines. Cornelius Agricola in De Re Metallica catalogues other evils associated with mining. Dry air, he writes, combined with the dust which is stirred and beaten up by digging, penetrates into the windpipe and lungs and produces difficulty in breathing. If the dust has corrosive effects, it eats away the lungs. A kind of cadmia, oxide of zinc, he writes, eats away the feet of the workmen when they have become wet, and similarly their hands, and injures their lungs and eyes. When fire is used in mines, the air is infected with poison, since large and small veins and seams in the rocks exhales some subtle poison from the minerals, which is driven out by the fire. And some mines spontaneously produce poison and exhale pestilential vapor, while workmen slipping from the ladders into the shaft break their arms, legs, or necks, or fall into the sumps and are drowned. Before the ore is assayed, it is roasted, burned, crushed, hammered, and reduced to powder, he also instructs in his book. And when gold and silver ore is being melted in the cupel, the assayer is advised to use protective equipment to prevent the great heat of the fire from injuring his eyes. When separating residual gold from the mercury used to melt it, the English translation of Lazarus Erker's treatise on ores and assaying gives the following advice. If you let the smoke away in the remaining quicksilver from the gold without distillation, take heed the smoke or vapor go not into thy belly, because it is a poisonous and cold vapor which lameth and killeth. And to prepare lumps of ore for smelting, they are put by on the stone and broken up with broad but not thick hammers. After that, they were subjected to fire when smelting and refining gold in furnaces. But in Guccio, in his Pyrotechnia, writes, masters make a very powerful fire by means of charcoal and the blast of the strong bellows, but the danger is always that the fire often harms instead of helps, for the virtue of the ore is consumed, making it evaporate and turn into smoke. For the fire is a violent, continuous, and long. This catalog of dangers and maladies associated with mining, assaying, and refining gold is probably entertaining on its own. But I invoke them all here because each evil represents a kind of ontological threat to poetry. The poisonous vapors and the furnace smoke destroy breathing, making it impossible to sing or even speak. The darkness as well as the heat of smelting affect eyesight, removing the ability to read. The deafening blasts and explosions would prevent the sound of poetry from reaching our ears. And while there is a compelling rhythm and certain music in the mechanical work of the hammers, It is too abrasive, too loud to allow room for proper poetry. The destruction of human limbs is equally detrimental. You cannot write without hands, nor can you measure poetic lines without feet. Unquenchable fires that accompany the production of gold from mining to goldsmithing can consume both human bodies and the implements and products of writing, paper, vellum, pens, books. Ben Johnson says hello here. And more broadly can see digging, collapsing, crushing, breaking, pulverizing, flattening, burning are all forms of unmaking rather than poesis. Poetic texts themselves acknowledge this. In a prefatory poem to Philip Ayer's collection Lyric Poems from 1687, Charles Dartneuf praises Ayer's original texts and translations as a metamorphosis of rock. Something thou gatherest too from Roman ore, and Spain contributes to thy well-got store, whence each by thee refined in English mold, verse smooth as oil doth flow, and pure as gold. Ayers himself, meanwhile, in his own poem of Gold, echoing Dartneuf's lyric, writes that gold, this glittering metal dazzler of the eyes, disclaims the earth when it has passed the fire, and then no longer owns the rock for sire. When coined, it boasts of power omnipotent, which monstrous birth the long-scorned mountain sent. Gold is a product of monstrous, exclusively male birth, assisted by fire. What I want to suggest, in other words, is that the iconography of poetry as mining, smelting, and refining gold harbors a possibility of its own negation. The raw energies of violence and darkness, of noise and mutilation, offer a glimpse of poetry's archaic, primordial other, imagining the serenity and splendor of the image of gold as a product of metamorphic disfiguration, opens the language of gold up to its own disturbing history, its not yet being. And to sustain this sort of representation, this ideal of poetry as gold must expel, erase, forget the convulsions and cacophony of the process that makes its emergence possible in the first place. Nietzsche, I believe, is helpful here. Thinking poetry as the art of Apollo, we are better positioned to understand the iconography of gold as a commitment, in Nietzsche's terms, to the full, one might say, immobile vision of beauty. This image worship, he continues, has its sublime goal in the ethical demand for measure, which runs parallel to the aesthetic demand for beauty. It is only possible to demand measure where measure and limits are held to be knowable. Vision, immobility, beauty, measure, knowledge. All these converge in the symbolism of poetic gold. But there are domains outside of Apollo's territory, where lies hidden in unthought what the sensual cornucopia of poetic gold does not wish to acknowledge: darkness, metamorphosis, excess, violence, death. Nietzsche calls it the demand for ugliness, all that is fearsome, wicked, mysterious, annihilating, and fateful at the very foundations of existence. But when Nietzsche associates these repressed pathological elements with Dionysus, I suggest that in order to deliver its golden world, poetry must forget Vulcan, the god of fire, mining, metallurgy, and forging. Admired for his craft, he is also disdained and despised for his foul appearance, lameness, cuckold status, and the ugliness of his trade. The Stuart Handbook for Aspiring Poets, the English Parnassus, lists the following epithets applicable to the god: laborious, smudgy, black, industrious, deformed, smoky, coaly, grimy, poultry, fiery, dusty, slow-footed, tardy-paced, lame, halting, rusty, musty, horned, cornuted. But it simultaneously praises him, among other things, for making Apollo's golden accessories. His bright chariot by Vulcan wrought, the beam and axle-tree of massive gold, on silver spokes the golden fellies rolled. The domain of poetry, or at least early modern poetry, can then be imagined as a site of contestation between the forces of the golden-haired Apollo, playing his golden harp and showering poets with gold, and those of the sooty and lame Vulcan, whose creative abilities as goldsmith are intertwined with destruction, noise, ugliness, metamorphosis, and violence. For all of poetry's wish to forget Vulcan, the poet's gold is unthinkable without his labor. Representing the negative forces within the iconography of gold and metallurgy, he challenges Apollo for the title of the god of poets, even though poetry itself is determined to repress and forget his influence. Thank you very much.